Hello. Welcome to the first meeting of the 2022 of the Germans from Russia, Oregon and Washington chapter of the Germans from Russia Heritage Society. The GROW board wanted to be cautious during this spike in COVID, and so we decided that doing a virtual program was called for rather than meeting in person. So here we are trying something new today. I am Sharon Bell, a GROW member since 2017 and a member of GROW and GRHS since about 2008. You can type comments in as we go, but I probably won't see them as I am busy presenting. So if you have questions, you can type them at the end of the presentation and I will try to answer them. This is visiting my family's North Dakota Ancestral Homeland. And I am solely responsible for the content presented here, and if there are mistakes, they are mine alone. Last spring, my husband Bill and I were trying to decide where to go for our summer road trip after being cooped up all winter. Since the GRHS 50th convention was postponed until 2021 from the year before, I suggested we take a trip to North Dakota. Bill thought that was a great idea to visit my homeland and for me to attend the convention. In preparation, I asked my mother, Catherine, for contact information for relatives in North Dakota. Her first cousin, Ron Schatz, and his wife, Betty, who still own the Schatz farm north of Bismarck, were the perfect people to meet to visit my ancestral land there. I emailed Ron and Betty asking if they would be willing to show us the family sites in July before I attended the convention. They were happy to do that for us. So we headed out on the slow roads, going through eastern Oregon, eastern Washington, the panhandle of Idaho, and into Montana. We spent 5 weeks getting to North Dakota, camping along the route and seeing the natural sights along the way, like Glacier National Park, Upper Missouri River Breaks, and Theodore Roosevelt National Park, where we in our car were surrounded by some big bison. More on that later. While camping below Lake Sakakawea and Garrison Dam on the Missouri River in North Dakota, I contacted my cousin Ron and set up a time for us to make the family locales tour the Monday before the convention. Before we get to the North Dakota tour, I will give you some background on my family before they made the move to the United States. My next slide is of a partial family tree, starting with my grandmother Ruth on the left and going back to my 4 times great-grandparents. As you can see, 2 of the generations were born in Germany and moved to Russia. The next 2 generations were born in Russia and moved to the United States. And then my grandmother's generation was born in the United States, except for her oldest sister, Julie, who was born in Russia. So here we see Europe and what we now know as Germany. The blue is the Danube River, the Black Sea, and the Odessa area where my family moved to. So my family came from the Württemberg district, of which Stuttgart in this area was the capital. Here we have Ulm on the Danube River and the Rhine River. And I apologize if I am mispronouncing any of these words. I'm not a native German speaker. My family, my 4 times great-grandfather, Samuel Schlickenmeyer, came from the village of Kottenweiler. He and his family left their village in 1817 to travel to South Russia for a new life. My 3 times great-grandfather, Johann David, was 9 years old. They traveled overland to Ulm, where they gathered with other immigrant families. From there, they traveled by boat down the Danube River to Ishmael. My 4 times great-grandfather Samuel Schlickenmeyer passed away here, leaving his widow and children to continue with other families to Hofmannsthal, Odessa. Many other immigrants lost their lives here due to poor living conditions and disease. Here we have Hofmannsthal. Johann's son, David, my 2 times great-grandfather, was born in 1841 along with many siblings. This village is now called Chebriskove and is lived in by Russians today. When we zoom in, you can see the center of the village. The church that the Germans built is still there. And then we can see the walls that bordered the properties of the villagers. In 1856, at 15 years old, David was sent to Odessa to apprentice as a carpenter, learning the wagon and furniture making trade. He lived with the carpenter's family during the 4-year apprenticeship. Now on to other locales of my ancestors. Here we have Hofmannsthal, Bessarabia, which was the 1845 birthplace of Paulina Schlafmann, David's future wife. This village was dismantled by the Russians at some point, but you can still see where the lots and the buildings once were. The village of Nikove is where Paulina Schlafmann lived with her parents prior to her marriage to David Schlickenmeyer in 1862. And New Freudenthal was the home of my great-grandfather Heinrich Schatz prior to immigration to the U.S. in 1900. He was the future husband of the widowed Christina Boley. And finally, we have Lichtenfeld. This is the village where David Schlickenmeyer and Paulina Schlafmann-Schlickenmeyer settled, purchasing a 225-acre farm and starting a furniture and wagon-making shop. They had 15 children, with 9 living to adulthood. This is where their 10th child, my great-grandmother Christina, was born. In 1894, David, contemplating moving to the U.S. since his second son, August, had been drafted into the Russian army, and David had 2 more younger sons that he didn't want to lose to the army when they came of age. However, Paulina's mother, Charlotte Leib Schlafmann, was still living, and Paulina didn't want to leave her behind. Also, their 15-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, was in failing health at the time. By 1901, both Charlotte and Elizabeth had passed away, and so the Schlickenmeyers decided to move to the U.S., where 3 of their adult children and families and a couple of brother-in-laws had resettled. To get to Antwerp, the Schlickenmeyer family packed their wagon and drove the 60 miles to Odessa. From there, they took a boxcar train to Warsaw, Poland, and then another train to Antwerp, Belgium. And that's that yellow line we see here as a possible train route. Antwerp, Belgium was the port where on the 12th of October 1901, the David Schlickenmeyer senior family departed by ship, arriving at Ellis Island 10 days later. Heinrich Schatz also had departed from Antwerp on the 10th of November a year before in 1900, arriving at Ellis Island 12 days later. Bremen, Germany is another location where many people left from. Albert Boley and Christina Schlickenmeyer Boley, my great-grandmother, may have departed from this port in early 1901 on the ship Maria Theresia. David Schlickenmeyer Jr. and sister Jakobina Schlickenmeyer Kiemeli and their families also departed from Bremen in 1899. So by ship, they traveled across the Atlantic Ocean landing at Ellis Island in New York. David Schlickenmeyer's Sr.'s family was briefly detained due to Paulina having some sort of an eye issue, which was common in immigrants. They were released into the U.S. shortly after it was resolved. They then took a train to St. Paul, Minnesota, and then on to Eureka, South Dakota. My great-aunt Susie wrote about her mother's story of her train ride. Ma told us how frightened she was looking out the train window, telephone poles speeding by, and she would flinch and scream to the amusement and laughter of other seasoned travelers. So Eureka, South Dakota was the end of their train ride. The Schlickenmeyer family reunited with the John and Paulina Keck, Johann and Jakobina Kimmeli, and David Jr. and Margaret Schlickenmeyer families, who came to the U.S. in 1899. The family wintered here at Carl Lang's place after the men filed claims at Washburn, North Dakota. So going back to the family tree, we now have David Schlickenmeyer and Paulina Schlafman moving to the United States along with, at the time, Albert Boley and Christina Schlickenmeyer. Now we'll move into the North Dakota area. In Eureka, South Dakota, in April of 1902, the families departed with a total of 8 families and their wagons. They had about 25 cattle and 25 horses that they took with them. The trip took parts of 5 days to arrive at their homesteads, stopping at Linton, Williamsport, Bismarck, and Wilton to camp along the way. So we have Linton here. I'm unsure where Williamsport is, but probably on the Missouri. Bismarck and Wilton. For a week they stayed at the Turn place while they built their soddies on their homestead lands. And here we have an overview of their new world. This is a partial picture of the Koenig Township plat, where Christina Boley and her husband Albert had 160 acres. David Schlickenmeyer Sr. had 2 plots of 320 acres. He had done some as a homestead, and the others he purchased later. David Schlickenmeyer Jr. is shown in purple here with 320 acres. John Kimmeli and wife Jakobina, sister of David Jr., had 160 acres. And then the Kecks also had some land. Christina Schlickenmeyer was married in early 1901 before immigrating to the U.S. to Albert Boley, who was born in Gross-Liebenthal, Odessa. Once arriving on their homesteads, my great-aunt Susie writes of her mother's recollection. They hurriedly built a one-room sod shack. Mom said the spring rains dripped down inside, also mud and lizards. Mr. Boley developed TB, so Mom had to do a man's work. To seal the cracks, she used mud and fresh cow manure till they could build a larger, more comfortable home in the summer. The prairie was strange and frightening to her, neighbors being not too near. They had 1 milk cow, 1 chicken, a couple of horses to start out their new life. One day her chicken was lost in the tall grass, so Mom, walking, crying, and despairing, searched and called out for the chicken until she found it. Albert Boley died of tuberculosis in 1904, leaving his pregnant wife, Christina, and 1 daughter, Magdalena, born in 1901 in South Dakota. Daughter Alvina was born later in 1904, after her father's death. Christina retained ownership of the Bully homestead after she was married to Henry Schatz in 1905. She sold it in 1930 when they retired from farming to McCluskey. So each of these properties typically was a quarter section, which meant there's a half a mile on a side. So Christina's was half mile by half mile. And David Schlickenmeyer, this lot was a mile by a half mile. The pothole land typical of this area was caused by glaciers melting at the end of the last ice age, leaving glacial till and no way for water to drain to a channel. Here we have the site of Zion Baptist Church and the cemetery that was built in 1906 by the local families. Prior to the church being built, they met in various family homes. My great-great-grandparents had changed from Lutheran to Baptist while still in South Russia. My grandmother and her siblings were brought up with the strict no card playing and no dancing rules of the Baptists. However, that did not mean that they didn't sneak out and do those things. So as you can see, the church site is just rubble. The building was taken down a number of years ago. And the Zion Baptist Cemetery is where my great-aunt Magdalena, who died at 19 of tuberculosis, is buried. There's no known grave marker for her, and some of the other grave markers included metalwork. So here's a memorial and picture of my great-aunt Magdalena Bully. And then the entrance to the cemetery. As you can see, the flags are a little ragged. My cousin and his wife and family and friends did some maintenance on Memorial Day at the cemetery and put up the flags, and that was only less than 2 months before we were there. So you can see that the wind of the prairie really blows a lot. And then here's a close-up of one of those metalwork grave markers. Most of the grave markers there, however, were the stone type. So my great-great-grandparents retired from farming in 1907 and moved to Turtle Lake with their unmarried son Carl and granddaughter Julie. Julie was raised as a daughter since she was born out of wedlock to Christina in Russia. Many family history books indicate she was David and Paulina's daughter rather than granddaughter, which adds confusion when doing research. Julie helped David with his city garden and farm that included a cow, some chickens, and a few pigs. Sometimes David would walk his cow back to his homestead land so that she could get some good grass. This was about a 12-mile hike one way, down the Red Trail. David and Paulina were charter members of the Turtle Lake Baptist Church that they helped build in 1907. The smaller rural churches like Alta and Zion joined with the mother churches in Washburn or Turtle Lake once the roads were improved such that members could get to the bigger churches in town. And today the Turtle Lake Baptist Church is here. One of David and Paulina's other sons ran a stock auction yard in Turtle Lake for years. There are still Schlickenmeyers living in the area. Here's the stockyard. And there used to be a railroad that went through town. In fact, it went through all of the towns in this area, but it was taken out a number of years ago as it was in disuse. So here's what my cousin told me was the retirement house of my great-great-grandparents. They had only farmed about 5 years before they retired. Some of the other sites we saw in Turtle Lake was a park that had some about 2/3 size war memorials. And here is myself and my husband Bill in front of Rusty, a giant, I think about 10-foot diameter turtle. He's made of 2 different kinds of metal. You can see the goldish bronze colored, and then a rusty, thus the name Rusty. And then there's the ironwork sign that indicates Turtle Lake was established in 1905, which was about 3 years after the family had homesteaded. Next we have the Turtle Lake Cemetery, and this is where David and Paulina Schlickenmeyer are buried. Bill and I drove here on our own and used Find a Grave to see what my great-grandparents' headstones looked like. Since they were so unique looking, it didn't take much time to find them, especially since we were parked only 50 feet away. We have other headstones too, the Kecks, and then the Kimmelis. So that Jacobina was the daughter of David Sr. and Paulina Schlickenmeyer and her husband John. And then here's myself with my great-grandfather's monument and my great-great-grandfather's monument and my great-great-grandmother's monument. And the cemetery was just a few, probably not even a mile out of town. And Rusty, the giant turtle, is right here near the playground. Now we'll move on to the Schatz homesteads and the Alta community. Here we have a partial view of the Edgemont Township plat, where brothers Henry and Carl Schatz, along with their wives sister Christina and Caroline, obtained land. So the homestead land is this one with the buildings on it. Henry Schatz, 80 acres, and he also had 160 acres up in this area. And then Carl Schatz owned 240 and another 160 in this area. And then you can see a school building up here on the Adams property. So the former school was up here, the Carl and Carolina Schatz farm, and then Heinrich's 2 plots here and here. After Albert Boley's death in 1904, Christina Boley married Heinrich Schatz in 1905 and moved to a farm south of Pickardville. Heinrich sold his original homestead to buy this farm and wooden frame house. My cousin Ron owns the land and farmed it himself until the late 1990s, but now leases it out to the homestead land out to a farmer. Ron plans to pass the farm down to his children. Most farming in the area is dry land, meaning they don't use irrigation. The groundwater from the melting snow and spring rains, with a high water table, along with summer showers, usually provides enough moisture. However, 2021 found the spring dry, and when we were there in mid-July, crops were noticeably withered and stunted. Ron said many farmers may have to put in a claim to their insurance of total crop failure. Ron has purchased water rights for the homestead land for future use. I asked what is usually planted, and Ron said they rotate crops yearly and include corn, wheat, and soy or pinto beans. Ron told us his dad, as a child, used to go to the slough area behind the shrub line and jump on the dry ground. That would be in this area. He could feel it slosh below the surface, indicating that it was wet underneath. And Bill and I had a similar experience in a dry side channel of the Missouri River. The surface was dry and cracked, but if jumped on would sink some due to the wet mud below. The Bachelor brothers, Hank and Ed, sons of Heinrich and Christina, farmed the homestead after their parents retired to McCluskey in 1930. They began cattle ranching at some point, selling their cattle in the fall before heading to the warmth of California or Texas for the winter. They had a garden where they grew watermelons and muskmelons, watering by hand from the well nearby. So the house used to be located here. There's an existing, the last remaining shed building here, and Ron said the farm was in this area and the summer kitchen was in this area. Here are some of the pictures. This was in 1986 when my grandmother Ruth Schatz, Long Granby, and my mother Catherine Bell visited Ruth's brother Ben in 1986. So we can see the old house and the big barn, and in the distance the only remaining building now, this smaller shed. Here's some more pictures from 1986 off in the distance, the house and barn and the shed that's still there now, and a couple of other buildings. Again, the house and the summer kitchen. And again, the house and summer kitchen with the access road. And here's a picture of my grandmother Ruth and her brother Ben and Ben's wife Ellie. And here's the picture of the cracked mud that Bill and I saw along the Missouri River. I don't know how many inches down it went, but it's quite far, probably 6 inches or so. And when you'd step on it, you could actually feel the wet, silty mud underneath give way. Here's a picture of the one-room schoolhouse that my grandma Ruth and Uncle Ben, great Uncle Ben, went to when they were children. And here's the only remaining building on our visit in July 2021. My cousin Ron Schatz removed the other buildings due to ongoing vandalism after his father passed away. And this is the homestead of Carl and Carolina Schatz. And I'm sure these buildings are not original, but someone still lives there and farms. I don't believe it's owned by the family any longer. And one of the reasons for the vandalism of the buildings on Heinrich and Christina Schatz land was because there's a lot of camping that's done along this lake. And so there's a lot of people that wanted firewood for their campfires, and so they would drive the short distance up the road and find these buildings. Since nobody lived on the property, they looked like they were prime things to tear down. So it was a shame he had to do that, but for safety, that's what he decided to do. My great-uncle Ben had purchased a farm that's now owned by his son Randy, who is Ron's brother. In the 1970s, a canal was going to be put through Ben's property, and during his protest of this eminent domain project, he had put up a very large sign on his hill protesting the canal. He also sued the government, but lost. He was, however, awarded more money for the acreage lost due to the canal that split his land. So we can see how it would have made it more difficult to farm when you couldn't farm a big chunk of your land. You had to strip right through the middle of it. The canal was supposed to go all the way to Fargo for irrigation for farms. However, Canada was afraid that the canal would cause environmental damage to the Red River, which flows from North Dakota to Canada, and so the completion of the canal was abandoned. It has also caused environmental damage in the area we were visiting. Now that these lakes are connected, algae, fish, pollution, and other unwelcome organisms are free to move about. So here we have Hecker's Lake, which Ron said that he and his siblings and other community children learned to swim at. And this was before the canal cut through and connected Hecker's Lake to other waterways. He said that the lake had some sort of property that would prevent the itching of poison ivy, and that there were no fish in it. So now that the canal has connected it, he says he never swam in it again. It was disgusting. Nearby we have the Alta Community Church, which is no longer in use, and cemetery. Which is where one of Carl Schott's babies was buried. Here we have my great-grandmother Christina Schatz in front of the homestead house on her land in 1961. At the time, probably Ed and Hank, the brothers, her sons were living there. And then here we have my great-grandmother Christina, my grandmother Ruth, my great-uncle Hank, my great-uncle Ed, and my mother Catherine, and my older sister Jan, who was about 9 years old, and they were visiting from Oregon. So here we have the Alta Cemetery with baby Reuben Schatz has been buried there. And when we were there, there was a gal picking up pine cones underneath the tree, and Ron asked what she was doing, and she said, "Oh, I'm helping out my brother. He doesn't like mowing the lawn over the pine cones," and he was planning on mowing the next day. So she was there picking up cones. And here's a picture of the church in 1986, obviously no longer in use. This was taken by Catherine Bell on a trip back there. And here's a picture I took last year when we were there. This is the house that Heinrich and Christina retired to in 1930s. My grandmother, their youngest child, graduated from McCluskey High School in 1933. And this is a shot that I took when we were there. And here's a shot back in 1961. My grandmother was about 5'2" at her tallest, and my mom about 5'8". And so you can see Christina was quite short, probably 4.5 feet tall. Here I am with my cousin Ron in the McCluskey City Cemetery, where my great-grandparents, Christina and Heinrich, are buried. And there's a memorial to their son Emmanuel, who died on a shipboard accident in World War II. He was in the Navy Reserves and was a carpenter's mate. The Bachelor brothers' sons, Ed and Hank, are buried also in the McCluskey Cemetery. The brothers had never married, and they farmed the family homestead after their parents retired. They changed over to ranching, selling the cattle in the fall, spent winters visiting the sisters in the Stockton, California area, and later in Laredo, Texas, where it was much warmer than North Dakota in the winter. Pickardville used to be a community, and my Grandma Ruth's cousin Theophil, or Butch, had a store here, and it's no longer in existence. Here we have McCluskey City Cemetery, where Christina and Heinrich Schott's house still survives, and the cemetery where they are buried. So after the tour of the homestead sites, Ron took us back to his town of Mercer and showed us his machine shop, which he bought in 1985 with Betty. Ron told me that when he was about 8, he would go to his dad's shop on the farm and burn welding rod. He had always had an interest in machines. Ron showed us the inside of the shop, and it's well over 100 years old and made of wood. That wood has that smell of oil that sort of permeates the surfaces, so you can see it's an old wood inside. He also has a newer addition that's insulated that allowed work in the winter to be bearable. Ron and his brother Jeff worked there together. In the winter, they would repair ice fishing augers, and one year he had to add on lengths since the ice got to be over 3.5 feet thick. They also work on snowplow blades for the highway department, putting the new cutting edges on them. So my cousin Ron, he's my mom's first cousin, and he worked for a number of years and just earlier this month passed away on the 11th. He worked with his brother Jeff, who would drive up from his home in Bismarck every day for work. So Ron said that Betty said when they got married that she wanted a house, and he said, well, we'll have to build it. So they designed and built their house with some help. So we went there after our tour, and Betty provided a sloppy Joe supper with root beer floats, and we met 2 of their granddaughters. Their daughter and her husband are local farmers in the area. Their son and his family live in Park River, North Dakota, a couple of 100 miles to the northeast. And here we have the area overview of the Schlickenmeyers and the Schatz areas. We hear stories about Regan. Washburn is where they filed their claims in the fall of 1901. This is the Missouri River. There's a story that if you ran out of fuel in the winter to keep warm, the man would, by horse and cart, go to Wilton to get some coal, but would have to stay overnight, as it was a long horse ride, and then come back the next day. So there would be some worried people at home, especially when there is a blizzard or a lot of snow. Bill and I, when we were there, we noticed that there's large coal mines in the area and coal-fired electric plants. So there's a coal place there and a coal mine here. It's quite interesting to sit in a cafe, and out the big window you could see the giant dump trucks moving around picking up the coal. So in 1976, my grandmother Ruth drove with her sister Julie from California to their brother Ben's place near the old homestead in 1976 for a visit and to explore. Ruth recorded some of their conversations, and this one was transcribed by my mom, but we can listen to it also.
This is holy ground.
There could usually only one or two fellas go along when they went to town.
How many times a year do you remember going to town?
Not over once a year.
And maybe to Alta, to Regan, and then to Peterville.
Yeah.
For sure, she went.
Elda. We went every week with me once or twice. Even took a few eggs along, bought some sugar.
Well, you remember in town, though, in McCluskey, that little store in Regan reminded me of that. They had a table in the back where you could go and sit and eat there.
Yeah.
That one little store in Regan I was in yesterday. They even had some buns for sale.
You went in there. I was thinking, why didn't, when you talked about a little country store, why didn't I think of Regan right in front of my nose? That's about the closest you can get nowadays to a little old country store.
I went in the back and they had dry goods store, yeah.
Here's my Grandma Ruth and her next in line sister, Susie, and then Alvina Boley and Julie Schlickenmeyer, and this was about in 1980. And this program is in memory of Ron Schatz. As I said, he passed away earlier this month. So I'm glad he was able to take us around and show us the sights. We really appreciated that. My sources for this program were conversations with Ron Schatz while touring the family historic sites, Life History of the David Schlickenmeyer Family by Marion Schlickenmeyer Kirschman, Keck Chronic by Esther Greeneich and Linda Lou Greeneich-Schmidt, audio recordings by Ruth Granby with digitizing and transcription by Catherine Bell, photos from Catherine Bell, Sharon Bell, Ernie Bell, excerpt from Sailing on Ship from Russia by Susie Schatz MacDonald, an excerpt from Clearing the Land by Susie Schatz MacDonald, Ancestry.com, FamilySearch.org, Heritage.statueofliberty.org. And on our way there and back, we saw great wildlife. We were amongst the bison and the moose. They were across the creek, a little ways away, and the pronghorns were pretty far away because they run at the first sight of anybody. But I'll let you make some comments if you want to, or ask questions while I show you a little video of the bison surrounding us while we're in our car. Well, that's all I have, so if nobody has any questions they want to type in, thank you for attending. this presentation of the Germans from Russia, Oregon, and Southwest Washington. Hopefully we can meet again in person, but if not in person, by computer. And this I will post to Facebook and hopefully be able to get it up onto YouTube too, so you could watch it again. Thank you, Irma. I'm glad you were able to watch. We had about 14 people that were tuned in at various times, so I appreciate you all coming. Thank you.